Another one from the Anguttara Nikaya. This is chapter 5, sutta number 156. The Tatiya Saddhamma Sammosa Sutta, the third discourse on the decline of the true Dhamma. So I'll start with paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll read through the discourse and give some explanations. And feel free to type in questions at any time, and I'll respond to those questions at the end. So we'll start with homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So as mentioned, this is Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 5, sutta number 156, Tatiya Saddhamma Sammosa Sutta, the third discourse on the decline of the true Dhamma. I'll go ahead and start reading through this discourse. Again, this is presumably the Buddha speaking. So it starts off, he says, mendicants. So that's bhikkhus, bhikkhunis. Just want to point out again this very important point that, again, the word bhikkhu or bhikkhuni literally means beggar, means mendicant, one who lives on alms food, one who lives on alms offerings. So the Buddha says, mendicants, these 5 things lead to the decline and disappearance of the true teaching. So a couple points here. First off, the word that's being translated as decline in Pali is sammosa, which also has the sense of becoming confused or false or incorrect. So sammosa, it's from the word musa, which means false or untrue or incorrect. One who might be familiar with the precepts, you'll recall that one of them is, in fact, musavada. Musavada means musa, false, vada, speech. So the 4th precept is musavada veramani, to refrain from false speech, incorrect speech, deceitful or incorrect speech. So here, sammosa means it's completely incorrect. It's false, it's deceptive, it's wrong. So it's translated here as decline, but it more precisely would mean the Dhamma becoming incorrect or muddled or confused or mixed up or deceptive, imprecise, inaccurate, untrue. And antaradana does in fact mean disappearance. So these are the things that lead to the true Dhamma becoming muddled, confused, misunderstood, or being distorted into something false and untrue, and ultimately to the true Dhamma disappearing entirely. Also, the term Saddhamma, it's translated here as true teaching or true Dhamma. So the prefix sat can mean true, but it can also have the meaning of morally good. So the Saddhamma is the good Dhamma. The teachings which are morally good, but also the teachings which are factually true, ultimately true. So in the suttas, the term Saddhamma is used to refer specifically to the Buddha Dhamma, because the Buddha Dhamma is that which leads to the highest good, the highest truth, which is full awakening. So the Buddha says, these 5 things lead to the decline and disappearance of the true Dhamma. What 5? The first one, he says, it's when the mendicants memorize discourses that they learned incorrectly with misplaced words and phrases. When the words and phrases are misplaced, the meaning is misinterpreted. This is the first thing that leads to the decline and disappearance of the true Dhamma. Again, a very important element of learning the Dhamma, especially for monastics, but also for lay practitioners who are serious about their practice. A very important part is studying the suttas, studying the discourses of the Buddha, as we're doing right now. So if we want to practice Buddhism, then we need to know what the Buddha taught. And the best way of learning what the Buddha taught is to study the discourses that are as close as possible to the Buddha's own words. Which these days, it's what we have in the Pali Canon, specifically the four main Nikayas and the four short Buddhavacana poetry collections. So this is where we have preserved the words that are most likely to be as close as possible to what the Buddha said. So studying the suttas and trying to understand the true Dhamma through what we learn in the suttas. Again, this is a critical element of Buddhist practice. However, if one has suttas which have been distorted, they've been rewritten, material has been added or subtracted or altered, or the suttas have even been written sometime after the Buddha's passing, even centuries after the Buddha's passing, then it's no longer a reliable representation of the Buddha's teachings. So this is the case here where the Buddha he's already predicting that there's going to be this exact problem arising of people learning something which they think is a discourse of the Buddha, but it's either distorted or incomplete, or things are out of order, or bits are missing, or things have been added, or it might be something that's completely false, something that's not even something the Buddha said at all. And sometimes this happens innocently. So you're listening to something or learning something and you just remember it incorrectly. And sometimes it happens less innocently. So throughout Buddhist history, there have been many, many times when people wrote new documents, which they then ascribed to the Buddha. So this has happened across all traditions in the Buddhist world. And this then has led to 2,000 years of misinterpretation and misunderstanding of the Dhamma. This profusion of incorrect discourses, discourses which were not originally spoken by the Buddha. Which then leads to people not understanding the Dhamma and to forming wrong ideas and getting caught up in incorrect understandings, which don't incline the mind towards awakening. So this first one, again, it's really emphasizing the importance of studying the Buddha's discourses and as much as possible getting back to the early Buddhist teachings. So the discourses which are as close as possible to what the Buddha himself said. So that means not Mahayana sutras. As much as I love Mahayana, we need to be realistic. The Mahayana sutras were not spoken by the Buddha. It means the Abhidhamma. Again, Abhidhamma can be very interesting, but it wasn't spoken by the Buddha. So we can't rely on that either. And even in the Sutta Pitaka, there's a few things which were clearly added later, sometime after the Buddha's death. So even with the Sutta Pitaka, we need to read with a discerning eye, acknowledging that there are some bits there which are not reliably the word of the Buddha. But if we do so, if we read the suttas with this careful and discerning eye, then we realize that we actually can still spot the Buddha's teachings in there. They're still present. And for the most part, they're still in a relatively pure and clear form. So then the second thing that leads to the decline and disappearance of the Dhamma, the Buddha says, "Furthermore, the mendicants are hard to admonish, having qualities that make them hard to admonish. They are impatient and they do not take instruction respectfully." This also helps a little bit to look a bit more closely at the words here. So what's translated as hard to admonish in Pali as dubbacca, literally means difficult to speak to. But elsewhere in the suttas, this is clearly defined as meaning someone who is difficult to give constructive criticism to. Someone who doesn't receive instruction well, as is mentioned here, but particularly somebody who doesn't receive criticism well. And the Buddha really emphasizes that the way that we help each other grow in the Dhamma, the way that we improve our practice is through the giving and receiving of admonishment. So if somebody has a problem with their defilements or some bad habits, well, it's really useful if their fellow companions point it out to them, to point out their blind spots or to help them understand how to work on the weaknesses in their practice. And for those who are on the receiving end, when we're on the receiving end of admonishment, it's important for us to really consider, is there truth in these words? How can I use these admonishments and advice as supports for my practice, as ways for understanding how to improve my practice? And there's a lovely discourse where the Buddha goes through a series of advices for how to receive admonishment correctly. If I recall correctly, it's the Anumana Sutta. The Buddha gives a series of instructions on how to receive admonishment well. And there's also a Dhammapada verse which emphasizes this very clearly. There's a Dhammapada verse where the Buddha says, one should see a person who points out your faults as a guide to hidden treasure. So somebody who's kind enough to point out to us our faults, they're showing us the path to awakening. So it might not feel like it at the time. Someone's like, oh, Venerable, you're very selfish and rude. And you're like, well, that's annoying. I don't want to hear that. But what they're doing is they're pointing out the next steps on the path to awakening. So being easy to speak to, easy to admonish, easy to instruct, easy to correct, then means that we'll be able to readily receive instructions and advice from others, especially those who are ahead of us on the path. But also sometimes those of us who are behind us on the path, they can still more clearly see our shortcomings than we ourselves can. So we're able to receive that and use that as a support in finding our way forward towards awakening. And the Buddha here also says, again, one of the qualities that is obstructive to the true Dhamma is to be akkama, so not kama, which the word kama can mean patience, as it's translated here, but it also has the meaning of tolerance, acceptance, and forgiveness. So akkama is translated here as impatient, but it also can mean intolerant and unforgiving. Again, this is relevant to the topic of receiving instructions and advice from one's fellow practitioners. If one is intolerant and unforgiving, somebody says something we don't like, it's like, oh, Venerable, you've got a problem with arrogance. And it's like, well, how dare you say that to me? It's like becoming very intolerant and resentful and then holding a grudge against them, so not being forgiving. So these are things which, again, obstruct the mind from cultivating the path to awakening. And of course, not taking instructions respectfully. So appadakina gahino anusasaning. So padakina means respectfully or appropriately, in the right way. So when an instruction is being given, we should be, when a Dhamma teaching is being given in particular, we should be listening respectfully and attentively, making an effort to understand the instruction that's being given, asking for clarification if needed. If we don't quite understand, it's good to ask for clarification. And then we actually try to put those instructions into practice. Now, these are all elements of receiving it appropriately, correctly, and respectfully. So this then is beginning to talk about the importance of applying the Dhamma to one's behavior. So of course it's important to read the suttas, as I just mentioned with the first one, but it's not sufficient. It's not sufficient just to read the suttas. It's important to actually make sincere effort to change our behaviors and attitudes to be more in line with the Dhamma. Then the third thing that leads to the decline and disappearance of the Dhamma, the Buddha says, furthermore, those mendicants who are very learned inheritors of the heritage who have memorized the teachings, the monastic law, and the outlines, do not carefully make others recite the discourses. And when they pass away, the discourses are cut off at the root with no one to preserve them. So again, this is the case of people who have studied the suttas, who have learned the suttas very well, but they don't instruct other people in the suttas. They don't help other people to learn the suttas. So you've accumulated this stockpile of Dhamma knowledge within your own mind, but then you don't encourage other people to do the same. So then what happens? Well, actually the drawbacks are felt immediately in that the next generation, because they don't know the suttas, they don't know the Dhamma, they don't know how to practice correctly, they go on their impulses and opinions, their wrong ideas, and they practice incorrectly based upon wrong ideas, and then the generation after that is even worse. And very quickly the true Dhamma disappears. This has been observed countless times throughout Buddhist history. You get one particular monk who's really amazing, possibly has some stage of awakening, incredible teacher with a really thorough understanding of Dhamma, and they teach their disciples, and their disciples are a bit less impressive. And then those disciples teach another generation, and those ones are even less impressive. And very quickly, the lineage fades into obscurity. So this has been documented over and over and over again throughout Buddhist history. So what is it? What is it that leads to decline and disappearance? It's when we do not make a sincere effort to teach the next generation in the suttas. We don't make a sincere effort to ensure that those who come after us are just as well versed as we are in the Buddha's teachings, if not even more so, even better instructed, even more thorough carriers of the Dhamma. And of course, prior to writing down the suttas, then this was even more important. The first 500 years of Buddhism was primarily an oral tradition, which meant that if nobody was memorizing and reciting the suttas, then it would have died out, and we wouldn't have any suttas. So it was even more important back then. But these days, it's still incredibly important because, yeah, maybe we have these sutta books, but if nobody picks them up and reads them, then we might as well not have them. If nobody is studying the suttas, then there's no point in having the suttas. It's the same as not having them at all. If we don't make an effort to study and analyze and understand the heritage of Buddhist teachings that we have in the suttas, then it's just the same as if they had been forgotten 2,500 years ago. So if we want to honor the heritage of the Buddha, then it's our duty to make an effort to study it and understand it, and to apply it. Then the fourth thing that leads to the decline and disappearance of the Dhamma, the Buddha says, furthermore, the senior mendicants are indulgent and lazy. They are leaders in backsliding, neglecting seclusion, not rousing energy for attaining the unattained, achieving the unachieved, and realizing the unrealized. And those who come after them follow their example. They too are indulgent and lazy, and so on. And so this is the fourth thing that leads to the decline and disappearance of the Dhamma. So again, this is emphasizing the importance of practicing the Dhamma teachings, of really making a sincere, resolute effort to apply them to our life, to change our habits and behaviors, our opinions and attitudes, to cultivate a heart and mind which is more in line with the Buddha Dhamma. Because, as the Buddha is saying here, if the senior monks are lazy, if the senior monks don't make any effort to control their defilements, then the junior monks will just copy that same behavior. It's like, oh, the abbot listens to music and eats dinner and doesn't do a minute of meditation and hasn't picked up a sutta book in years. Why should I? Why should I waste my time meditating and studying if not even the senior monks do that? So then, again, this leads to decline over time. So again, it's recognizing that we set an example for others. And the longer one is a Buddhist, and especially the longer one is a monk, the more other people look to you as an example of how one should behave, of what's an example of proper Dhamma conduct. So it becomes even more important to cultivate a sincere Dhamma practice, not only for our own sake, but also to set a good example for others. And again, although this statement here is aimed specifically at senior monks, so senior bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, it also applies to any layperson who's been practicing for more than a few years. If you meet a lay practitioner who says, oh, I've been practicing Buddhism for 30, 40 years, it's like, oh, well, then you should be a role model of a good lay Buddhist. That means you should be following the 5 precepts assiduously, unfailingly, without the slightest error. It means you should understand the suttas. If you've been practicing Buddhism for 30 years, you should have read the suttas cover to cover a dozen times by now, whether you're a monk or a lay person. You should be practicing meditation. You should be doing chanting every day. You should be making a real effort to embody the Buddhist teachings for lay people, because other lay people will be looking at you as a role model, as an example. So the longer one is a Dhamma practitioner, the more important it is to practice well, to set a good example for others. And then the 5th thing that leads to the decline and disappearance of the true teaching, the Buddha says this is when there's a schism in the Sangha. And when the Sangha is split, they abuse, insult, block, and forsake each other. This does not inspire confidence in those without it, and it causes some with confidence to change their minds. This is the 5th thing that leads to the decline and disappearance of the true teaching. So this one again is aimed at the monastic community, the importance of the monastic community to make an effort to live together in harmony and to support each other in Dhamma practice. So not getting caught up in arguing and disputing and quarreling, especially over silly things or minor things. Because when the Sangha is engaged in dispute, then it makes it hard for us to practice well. And then it leads to the lay people thinking, well, if even the monks can't practice well, then it's clearly hopeless for us lay people as well. So again, it's recognizing that cultivating harmony, mutual appreciation, mutual tolerance, mutual support is something which is of benefit not just for the members of the monastic community, but also for all the lay people that look to the monastics for inspiration. So these are the 5 things that lead to the decline and disappearance of the true Dhamma. So then the Buddha gives the positive counterparts to those 5. The 5 things that lead to the continuation, persistence, and endurance of the true teaching. So what are the 5? So the first one, so when the mendicants memorize discourses that have been learned correctly with well-placed words and phrases, when the words and phrases are well organized, the meaning is correctly interpreted. So this is the first one, which again, as I was mentioning earlier, is emphasizing the importance of studying the early Buddhist discourses. Not getting misled by the writings, the Dhamma writings of later authors. Just not to say there's no value in the later compositions, but rather that they always need to be understood as secondary to the early Buddhist discourses, the discourses which are reasonable to believe were spoken by the Buddha. Then the second one, the mendicants are easy to admonish, having qualities that make them easy to admonish. They're patient, tolerant, and forgiving, and they take instructions respectfully. Then the third one, those mendicants who are very learned, inheritors of the heritage, who have memorized the teachings, the monastic law, and the outlines, carefully make others recite the discourses. When they pass away, the discourses are not cut off at the root, and they have someone to preserve them. So again, this is emphasizing the importance that we don't just study the suttas ourselves, but we also make sure that the next generation is studying the suttas with the same degree of dedication, to the same degree of depth. And then the fourth one, the senior mendicants are not indulgent and lazy, leaders in backsliding and neglecting seclusion. Instead, they rouse energy for attaining the unattained, achieving the unachieved, and realizing the unrealized. Those who come after them follow their example. So again, this is emphasizing the importance of those who are in positions of being role models, leaders, those who have been monks for a while or have been practicing as a layperson for a long time. It's really important that we set a good example for the others, so that they will follow a good example rather than following a bad example. And finally, the Buddha says, the Sangha lives comfortably, in harmony, appreciating each other, without quarreling with one recitation. When the Sangha is in harmony, they do not abuse, insult, block, or forsake each other. This inspires confidence in those without it, and increases confidence in those who have it. So the monastic community should be making an effort to support each other on the path, to appreciate each other, to help each other come to a deeper understanding of the Dhamma in a way that is friendly and kind, a way that it's coming from a place of genuine caring and thoughtfulness and compassion. So learning to see all of our fellow Sangha members as our beloved siblings, our beloved friends and relatives who we live with out of a genuine wish to support each other on the path to awakening. So that's the end of the discourse. So I'll go ahead and respect the sutta with 3 sadhus, and then we'll see if there's any questions. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And hello to the people who are checking in online. Hello to Tiantong, Rebecca, Richard, Manal, Karuna, Jody, Yankee, Madeline, Gregory, Hari Naidu, Maria, Vanessa, and everyone else who's watching and joining in. And I see a couple of questions here. So Vanessa says, how can we have discernment between admonishment and verbal abuse? For example, critique that is purposefully harsh or mean. How can we take critique while also holding compassion for ourselves? Yeah, so this does require a certain amount of discernment when receiving admonishment from others. When receiving admonishment, the Buddha did give some advice on how to do so well. One thing is actually first to consider, is it true? Is what the person is saying to me actually true? And if it's not true, then we don't need to worry about it. We can just conclude, oh, this person doesn't understand what they're talking about, or they have some misinformation. So we don't need to be bothered. We can also consider, is it being said at the right time? So maybe somebody has some criticism for you, but it's not an appropriate time and place, in which case you can tell the person, like, oh, thank you, I'm very happy that you want to offer some instruction to me. Let's set the proper time and place for it. Let's meet at such and such time and place where I can give the proper attention to what you have to say. Considering whether what the person is saying is beneficial. So somebody might be offering some criticism, but it's actually not helpful. It's not helpful to you, and it's not helpful to others. So in that case, you just acknowledge within yourself, like, oh, this is actually not beneficial. In which case, you don't need to take it on. And the Buddha also said, once again, that admonishment should be delivered gently. So if the other person is delivering admonishment in a harsh way, an aggressive or violent way, well, then we also look at our own mind and we recognize, oh, that's why I'm having a hard time receiving this. Because it's being delivered in a way which is harsh, which is aggressive or verbally violent. But in that case, we should still acknowledge, like, okay, this might be emotionally upsetting the way it's being delivered, but is there still some actual Dhamma truth in what they're saying? And this can be really challenging because often when something is delivered in a harsh way, we fixate on the harshness and ignore the underlying content. So it takes a certain amount of self-awareness and self-restraint in order to separate those two things apart. And to see, like, okay, yes, this person might be speaking in a way which is harsh and improper, but if they are saying something which is true in terms of Dhamma and which is beneficial in terms of Dhamma, then I should still pay attention to that and try to overlook the harshness. And then the fifth one is, again, to see, is the person speaking from a place of genuine metta, so genuine benevolence, genuine interest in your well-being, or are they speaking from a place of inner hostility, of aversion? So again, this is also to evaluate the objectivity of what the person is saying. Like, are they actually just speaking in order to hurt you? Or are they actually just speaking out of resentment or spite? And if that's the case, then yeah, you do need to be a little bit more cautious about taking on what the person is saying. If they're not actually trying to bring benefit to you, if they're not actually trying to help you practice the Dhamma, if their motivation is from something else, from hostility or aggression, then actually, yeah, you don't need to take it on. It still might be useful to say something like, thank you, I appreciate your advice, and leave it at that, and move on. And sometimes actually the proper thing to do is if you do discern that somebody is speaking to you purely from a place of hostility or aggression, then sometimes actually the kindest thing you can do for them is in fact to stop and tell them, like, I'm sorry, I can't receive this kind of hostile instruction from you. If in the future you're feeling sufficiently calm and kind enough to speak to me, then we can speak at that time. So sometimes the right thing to do is actually to stop the person and tell them, like, no, this isn't the right time, place, and manner for this. We need to do this another time when they're able to deliver the instruction correctly. And we have a question here from Rebecca. Rebecca says, where do the Mahayana Sutras come from? Well, the Mahayana Sutras were mostly composed during the period between 0 AD and 1000 AD. So starting about 500 years after the Buddha's passing and going until about 1500 years after the Buddha's passing. Most of them were composed in India, particularly northern India, though a handful of them appear to have been written in China. And of course then there's quite a number that were composed in Tibet later on. I mean, where do they come from? They come from predominantly Buddhist monks who came to ways of relating to and understanding the Dhamma which were not explicitly stated in the early texts, and they made an effort to record their ideas and concepts about Dhamma practice and ideas and concepts about Buddhist doctrine. And the way that was done was to put them into the format of a sutra. And to usually to ascribe it to the Buddha or to one of the main bodhisattvas. So again, this doesn't mean that the Mahayana Sutras are necessarily wrong. In fact, there's a lot of really good material included in many of the Mahayana Sutras. But it means that they always take second place to the early discourses. So just as things like the Pali commentaries and the Abhidhamma take second place to the early sutras. It's not that they're necessarily bad or wrong, it's just that they were composed hundreds of years later by other people than the Buddha. So then it always takes second place at best. Karuna says, does this sutta suggest that we still have a literal obligation to memorization, even with teachings now preserved in print form and digital spaces? I would be a little bit hesitant to use the word obligation. I would rather use a word like opportunity. So are you obligated to memorize things? You're not obligated to. Is it extremely helpful? Yes. Especially as a monk, it's really helpful to memorize a bunch of discourses. Actually, one lovely thing is when out doing wandering practice is to recite the things that one has memorized. And it also really inscribes the Buddha's teachings in your mind. When you memorize something, it becomes very deeply embedded in the mind. Whereas if you read something, it tends to just kind of bounce off the surface. Unless you read something over and over again, then it starts sinking in. So I don't think you have an obligation to memorize suttas, but I do believe that it's very beneficial to do so. And I memorized a lot of suttas over the years, and I found it really helpful. It really, really does help to inscribe the Dhamma in your mind. So Kruna says, you gave a much more expansive rendering of sunikita than the dictionary definition. Does it also include understanding the teachings with attentiveness and rigor, not vagueness or sloppily? Well, this is actually something about dictionaries. Dictionaries are rarely comprehensive. And especially the older Pali dictionaries are quite limited. And so the best way one comes to an understanding of words is through seeing them in context, in a wide variety of contexts all over the place. So yeah, this does mean that there's often much more depth in range to words than just what you see in the dictionaries. And this becomes clear as one learns the Pali language and reads the suttas in Pali. So, as we were saying, does it also include understanding the teachings with attentiveness and rigor, not vagueness or sloppily? Yeah, I would agree with that. I would definitely agree with that. So, in learning the Dhamma, it's not enough just to read the suttas. It's also about really trying to understand what the suttas are talking about and looking at your own mind and applying them to your own mind. And also always considering that maybe our perspective is incomplete, distorted, not objective, and always therefore engaging in open conversation and dialogue with other people, asking for their opinions about the suttas. So this is especially for monastics. It's very easy to think like, oh, I understand the Dhamma, I've got everything right. Well, this is why it's important to go and talk to other senior monks and be like, well, what do you think about this? What's your opinion on this sutta or this doctrinal point? Why do you see things that way? And this helps to give a much more fleshed out understanding of the suttas, a fleshed out understanding of the Dhamma teachings, especially when there's points of disagreement or controversy. Engaging in an open discussion, starting with the assumption that your own viewpoint may be wrong. It may be right, but it may be wrong. Then engaging in this open discussion about these debatable topics can really help to lead to a deeper understanding. Rebecca says, what suttas would you recommend for a lay practitioner to memorize? Well, I mean, the most basic things, which I think pretty much any Buddhist should memorize. First off, the recollection of Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, the Itipiso, Bhagava, Arahang, etc. If you haven't memorized that by now, shame on you. Memorize it. It's very short, and we use it all the time. And it's the basic list of the praiseworthy qualities of Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. You should also know the meaning of every word in that chant. Every word is important. Every word is laden with meaning. After that, it's good to memorize the Mangala Sutta. And again, know the meaning of every word. The Mangala Sutta is another one of these incredibly beautiful, concise, compact summaries of the entire Buddhist path, condensed into about a 1 minute long chant. It's incredible. It's incredible how much information is packed into that short discourse. So memorize the Mangala Sutta. And it's also very common to memorize the Karaniya Metta Sutta, another short and very important discourse. And again, when memorizing things, I actually recommend learning the meaning of each word. Even if you're not planning to learn Pali, though I can't imagine why you wouldn't want to learn Pali, but I understand there actually are a lot of people who don't want to learn Pali. I don't know why. It actually seems to be the majority of people don't want to learn Pali. Just mind-blowing. Anyway, even if you don't want to learn Pali, you should learn the meaning of each word in these three main chants that I just mentioned. So the Itipiso, recollection of Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, the Mangala Sutta, the discourse on the highest blessings, and the Karaniya Metta Sutta, the discourse on how to do loving kindness. Memorize those three and the meaning of each word, so that when you recite them, you know what you're reciting. Okay. And that's the last question from online. Anything from the residents here? Anything on this discourse? Do you have a question?
What's the fifth one you said from
The fifth thing that leads to the decline of the Dhamma.
Mm-hmm.
So the decline one is when the Sangha is split, and the monks are constantly abusing and insulting and obstructing each other. And then the positive side, which supports the continuance of the Dhamma, is when the Sangha has the same path. So samaga, they have the same path of practice. They're committed to the Eightfold Path together. They appreciate each other. So sammo dhammano means appreciating each other, rejoicing together, not arguing and disputing. So making an effort to live together in harmony and support each other's practice. Okay?
And what was the second and the third positive one?
I think you should just reread the sutta
Oh, okay.
rather than have me reread it for you right now.
Thank you.
Yeah. You had a question?
Yeah, it's kind of tangential, so it's okay. I am confused about the predicted length of time of the Buddha's dispensation.
You should bring that to monk chat. That's off topic. Monk chat this evening. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay, we'll go ahead and conclude at this time with 3 more sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.